Hi all, today we'll discuss about top 20 Java with AWS Spring Boot real-time interview questions for the 7 year of experience. So what all are the questions they are asking for this Java with AWS requirement? So the first question is how do you connect a Spring Boot application with AWS RDS? So either we will use the property or YAML file where we have to define this Spring data source, Spring.data source. The second question is what is the role of AWS S3 in Spring Boot applications? Why we are using S3, AWS S3 and when to use that? The third question is how to integrate AWS SNS and AWS SQS in a Spring Boot. So why we are using and when to use that? The next question is how do you deploy the Spring Boot applications in AWS Elastic Beanstalk? How we will deploy it and all? What is AWS CLI and all? The next question is how do you manage application secret in AWS with a Spring Boot? The next question is what is Lambda, AWS Lambda, and how can be used in a Spring Boot? The next question is how do you monitor a Spring Boot applications running on AWS? The next question is how do you configure auto scaling for a Spring Boot application in AWS? Auto scaling. And the next question is how to what is the use of AWS API gateway and Spring Boot applications? What is API gateway and what is AWS API gateway? When to use AWS API gateway in a Spring Boot application? The next question is how do you use AWS DynamoDB in a Spring Boot applications? The next question is explain how to manage security and access control for the AWS Spring access control for Spring Boot applications on AWS. Now we'll ask the CI/CD. How do you set up a CI/CD pipeline for a Spring Boot application on AWS? The next question is how does Spring Boot work on AWS Cloud Formation? The next question is how do you handle applications logging in a Spring Boot application on AWS or with AWS? The next question is how can you leverage AWS ECS for running a Spring Boot applications? What is the role of AWS ECR in a Spring Boot microservice architectures? And how do you handle event driven architectures with a Spring Boot and AWS? The next question is how do you secure communications with microservice in AWS using a Spring Boot? The next question is explain how to use AWS Elastic Logs load balancers with a Spring Boot application. The next question is how do you optimize the cost of running a Spring Boot applications on AWS? So these all are the top 20 questions which is asking for AWS with the Spring Boot requirement with the 7 years of experience. Freshers to 7 years of experience. If you want, you can refer this for this interview purpose. Yeah, thank you.